as parents, you worry about your kids' screen time. Now, as a driver, I'm worried about my screen time.
We need to, especially, in the context of India, in cities like Bombay, Delhi, Bangalore, where every second is critical. You can't take your eyes off the road even for a second.
It's very interesting. Toyota, Honda, Volkswagen Group, they've all said that, yes, we have faced this sort of resistance to putting everything onto the touchscreen. And we are going to bring back buttons into our cars.
In the current generation, it's all a gimmick. I mean, even, things like open sunroof, when you can just reach the button right there, which is much faster.
Phone OS manufacturers are going to be taking over car functions as well, even down to like your HVAC controls, your AC and heating.
And even your driver display.
And your driver display, right. Welcome to Autocar Deep Drive, our weekly podcast powered by Kotak Mahindra Prime. It's a podcast, as you know, if you've been familiar and logging in regularly, viewing our podcast, you'll know we discuss all things automotive. Today, we're discussing automotive technology. And so with us is Nishant Padhiar, our editor for Stuff Magazine and What HiFi Magazine. And I think, as you can tell from the two watches he's wearing.
Yeah, I think 24 hours is not enough for me.
Right. Why the two watches before we get into the tech though, Nishant? What do you
it's going to be the eternal battle between Apple and Samsung, and I wear the battle very close to my sleeve, as you can see.
Okay. So comparison coming up?
It's a comparo that's happening in the next edition of Stuff.
Okay, great. So yeah, look out for it on Stuff. We've got a website and a magazine as well, and of course social media, as we must always have today, right? So Nishant, let's discuss tech, and I think it's so interesting that we finally got to do like I would say crossover, but really it's more like now a merger. Tech and cars are sort of fusing into one, right?
I mean they are. I think they're so closely linked together, and cars are just not a form of transportation anymore. Just like how smartphones have become an extension of our life,
right.
When we're at home or in the office, I think in-car infotainment and entertainment systems have become an extension of ourselves when we're on the go, on the move. So it's, I think they're both inextricably linked. And I think these days you can't possibly find a car without a touchscreen. It's becoming increasingly rarer to find a car with, just analog controls.
Correct. And I think, touchscreens, of course, it's also now expanding beyond that screen. We'll get to that. But let's just look back. I think the tech world entered cars with literally the car phone, right? Where you had a phone,
absolutely,
with its own, I assume its own GSM chip.
Yeah. And those were, I think, very early days of the car phone, and the calls themselves were so expensive, to the tune of 120 rupees a minute. So it was only for, the uber rich and a certain strata of society. Of course, then we had Bluetooth. We also went through the whole different formats, the actual physical formats of cassette tapes and CDs.
Right.
CD changers were a thing in the car as well, where I remember they used to be trunk mounted. For me, in fact,
I had one.
Yeah, I'm sure all of us at some point. In fact, for me, the first memory of something radical in the car goes, in fact, way back when I used to have a W124 E-Class, and it used to have a motorized FM antenna that used to extend from the boot. And at that point of time, I think in the early 90s, it made me feel like I'm connecting with some extraterrestrial life form. Think of it now, it just seems so rudimentary, and how far we've come. The new, like we were talking offline about the new EQS, for example, having a 56-inch hyper screen.
Right.
So yeah, we've come a long way from there.
Yeah, so Nishant, absolutely. I mean, the screens everywhere, as Onwas actually once said, I remember, he said, man, in my time, the biggest screen was the windscreen, right? Right now, screens are literally the size of windscreens, A-pillar to A-pillar.
Exactly.
You've got some in the back for passengers, theater screens. But, I want to discuss this whole thing about too many screens and distractions, because, in fact, I did a column about it some time ago, saying, as parents, you worry about your kids' screen time. Now, as a driver, I'm worried about my screen time, because I think it's too distracting. I mean, okay, for a tech guy, I'm sure you're probably happy to see a lot of screens in there. And I do admit there is a lot of benefit to it, which I'm sure you can extrapolate on. But it's also distracting to the point where it's a safety hazard, in terms of you got to take your eyes off the road to look at what you want to interact with. There could be distractions like a passenger playing a movie, and not all cars have the privacy filter. What's your take on the screens? Let's start with the screens, Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Does there need to be some regulation in how we use it in cars?
I think you're absolutely right. I think we need to find a sweet spot where we have certain physical controls which are still analog in their operation, which don't require you to take your eyes off the road for too long. And like you rightly mentioned, the amount of time that we need to, especially, in the context of India, in cities like Bombay, Delhi, Bangalore, where every second is critical. You can't take your eyes off the road even for a second, be it for a pothole, be it for a pedestrian crossing, somebody jaywalking. It all happens, right? All happens simultaneously. So it's imperative that we have all our attention. In fact, if you ask me personally, I also sometimes get distracted with the heads-up display because even that, in fact, gets in the way of what things are happening on the road in front of you. So I think the whole trend of having multiple screens, including a passenger side screen, that's, I think, taking things a bit too far. Having something for the passenger, maybe it's useful for the passenger when you're stationary, but on the move, again, in the Indian context, it's a bit of an overkill. I think the current sweet spot, which I think a lot of brands have achieved, is the 10.25 or the 12-inch screen, landscape mode or portrait mode, whichever the center console and the dashboard allows. I think that's a pretty good sweet spot with physical controls for HVAC, for some media controls. I, again, personally am a big fan of a physical volume knob. Right. And I've also mentioned it in several of my reviews when I review the car tech systems. The kind of tactility it offers, you can't match that with the capacitive button. And also the instantaneous control, right? I mean, when you're, for example, if you're answering a phone call or rolling your window down and having a quick word with someone, just to have multiple taps to the tune of 10 or 15 taps to bring the volume down low, as opposed to just twisting the knob quickly, it just makes so much of a real world difference in in just the amount of time you engage with the system.
Absolutely, and you're right, the sweet spot for the size and also then the balance of buttons. And like you said, HVAC, radio controls, media controls, let's say. Yeah. I mean, I fully agree with that. For me, I hate, and I mean, people would know this on our reviews, I hate when there's, touch screen or a touch panel or a touch surface for HVAC controls, because you look at your AC temperature or your fan speed, sometimes it goes too high, sometimes too low. And, interestingly, Nishant, 2026, 1st Jan 2026, Euro NCAP will be sort of mandating that you have physical controls, and there are 5 of these sort of features. So the hazard switch, they say that it shouldn't be on the touchscreen. Also from a point of view of, what if the touchscreen just packs up, right? You need to be able to, when your car's stranded, you need to be able to turn on your hazard
manually override that.
Exactly. So they have to have a physical switch for that, for the horn, for the wipers. I'm forgetting the other 2, but they still not extended it to, well, like what we just discussed, the AC or the media. That is still not mandated as a sort of volume. And I think, though, consumer sort of behavior will force brands to move or bring back buttons, because it's very interesting. Toyota, Honda, Volkswagen Group, they've all said that, yes, we have faced this sort of resistance to putting everything onto the touchscreen, and we are going to bring back buttons into our cars. Honda, they said very clearly that, yes, it was a mistake to try and look at touchscreens, And of course, the temptation is, the cost. A screen is going to be put into a car in any case, so you might as well delete a few buttons, which is a repetitive cost, right? I mean, it's not just programming sort of a sort of software. Every car that goes out has those 10 buttons. If you can save 10 buttons on every car,
absolutely,
it's a huge cost. So there is a temptation for them to knock out buttons. There's a benefit to the manufacturer. They have been doing it to save cost, not really for anything else. Let's be honest. You can say that, okay, it's a little techie feel, but frankly, it's a cost reason that they've deleted buttons. And I think consumer behavior will bring it back, if not legislation. The other bit is also, I think a tangible benefit though is you can add features more easily,
via OTA updates.
Exactly, via OTA updates. I mean, you know all about that. That's your world, the OTA update. I mean, it irritates me, honestly. Like our Creta had a OTA, the long-term, recently an OTA update. And, I kept putting it off, saying, like, I'm not going to sit there and wait for the damn thing to download. But something very interesting, Nishant, and I think we have a picture of that. It had the option to update while the car was switched off.
I know, yeah.
Yeah, so actually, how is that possible? I mean, in the first place. So you mean that there is power still going there and there's processing still happening? Or?
So it downloads it, and when you switch on the car, the next time it actually installs it. So, and the installation process, usually these files are very small. It's not like a heavy update. Usually they'll just be unlocking a couple of key features, which are not very heavy in terms of the file download itself. So it downloads the file while the car is stationary or while it's switched off, because it has an eSIM. And only when the car is switched on, we actually install it to the operating system.
Okay, so it's not the install that's also happening while the car is on.
No, only the download is happening. The install happens while the car is, the next time you switch, crank the engine on. But,
Okay.
Interestingly, I mean, like you mentioned, in terms of brands being mandated by the Euro NCAP or whichever regulatory measures, I think certain brands are still taking the step in the right direction, like Mercedes, for example, like JLR, they have the PV Pro system, where if you look at the center console and the dashboard, it looks brilliantly clean and elegant and minimalist because there are hardly any buttons on the screen. But I think the way they actually get to that point is something called zero layer design, which means that anything you want to get to should be available to the user within 1 or 2 taps or maximum 3 taps, which is still, I think, a tap too much.
Right.
But at least, they're within the last few years, they've achieved that kind of fluidity in the entire operating system.
Right.
Given the complexity, the amount of things it has to handle and the amount of things that you rely on such touchscreens for, I think 2 taps has become quite, I think, good sweet spot for most touchscreen only based systems,
Right.
where you can get to whatever function you want within a few seconds.
No, I get what you're saying, but I would still prefer buttons because I guess maybe car and tech world, whatever, but
Also because you're 120.
yeah, true, true. Different, but yeah. No, for example, a very practical scenario, if you're in Apple CarPlay or Android Auto on your center touch screen and you need to access a certain car function, you've got to hit that icon, say exit to the car's OS. So that's like 2
Right.
taps. Then in the car's OS, you're presented with the home screen. Then you navigate to that, whatever you were trying to do. And then you got to go back to home screen and Android. That's about 5-6 taps away, from. And sometimes there are some very interesting, like for example, cool seats on the Hyundai Ioniq. They don't have a physical button,
Yeah.
right? They're in the touch screen. So you turn it on with your 5 taps, and then later you feel your butt getting too cold and your back getting too cold, and you want to, now turn it off. It's another 5-6 taps.
Yeah, I totally agree. Like certain things like that are infuriating. Like even in the Porsche, I think Panamera, I think the previous gen Panamera, the AC vents had to be controlled via the touchscreen, which in fact they revoked now in the new generation.
Right.
They've gone back to physical controls. Certain things I think were added just for the gimmicky factor.
Exactly.
Because a few years ago, screens were all great and fancy, and you could increase the perceived value and the experience of the car.
The wow.
Yeah, the wow factor of the car.
But having said that, the gimmicky thing, there's another gimmick. Well, not gimmick. There are 2 other features, let's say, that are coming, which I want your opinion on: gesture control and voice control. Right. For something like volume, you're driving along, you can take your left hand off and do this and raise the volume or lower the volume.
Yeah.
What do you think about that? And which of the 2 do you think will be sort of the one that will emerge as staying on?
Before we get to the experience, the user uptake is going to be defined by how consistent these experiences are. Because in my own experience, after driving so many cars with gesture controls, typically BMWs, while they work, sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. But it only takes one instance of it not working, when you're in a situation of, I mean, I wouldn't say emergency situation, but even, just trying to navigate traffic or dodge a pedestrian. And if you're trying to do that, if it doesn't work, especially when you can just reach the volume control and,
on the steering.
On the steering itself, when something is so direct, why would you want to go an indirect way or use an indirect method? Count on it, maybe it being consistent, not consistent. So I think it all depends on how well tuned and calibrated these systems are. So between, I think, gesture and voice may eventually win because, I mean, we've all seen voice controls for simple things like opening sunroof and changing the temperature, changing the radio station. But as we get AI into cars, and because our phones are already getting AI, and I'm sure that's going to permeate through the car environment as well, either via phone mirroring or cars themselves having native AI as well. We've seen some Volkswagen models already having ChatGPT. I'm sure, with the new generation of AI, ChatGPT is still now 2 years old now. With the new generation of, say, Google Gemini or Apple Intelligence, voice is going to get a lot more sophisticated, the way it deciphers different accents, different dialects. So I think in terms of consistency, you can actually tune your system and program your system to be a lot more receptive to different dialects than different motions.
So clearly then, I think, I agree with you fully also, because I find the whole concept of gesture control quite ridiculous because your hands needed to be on the wheel. You have perfectly fine buttons over there. why would you start
There's no need
waving
to
around?
reinvent the wheel. So
Exactly. And yes, voice is also something natural, right? You do it all the time. You speak to people. We are speaking to each other right now. So as a consumer, I think what consumer advice, don't get wowed or give too much importance to gesture control, right? It's I think more a gimmick. Voice control is something where,
as of now, I think in the current generation, it's all a gimmick. I mean, even things like open sunroof, when you can just reach the button right there, which is much faster. But again, it's something that gives you bragging rights with your friends, with your mates, when you want to show off your new car with features that nobody else has. Yeah, so and makes for great marketing material.
Right. So when we're talking of also now, useful and useless kind of features and tech bits, I have to bring in apps also into this discussion, right? Should people look at, the number of apps on a system? For example, today, I mean, even the XUV 700, for example, or Mahindra's high-end Mercedes, they've got a lot of apps built in.
Yeah.
Is this something we should be paying attention to, not just as a motorist, but just as a general consumer of, tech and services?
There are some things which are indispensable. Google Maps, for example, is an app which we can't live without now. Everybody knows that it's become a part of our lives. I mean, in most conditions, we can't even think of venturing out somewhere into the unknown without having Google Maps connected to our CarPlay or Android Auto screens. But certain things like Sudoku or Tetris, I mean, that's really pushing the boundaries. Maybe for the passenger, because some of these luxury cars you mentioned also have passenger screens. And perhaps you could, kill some time at the traffic lights, or when the driver has gone out for a coffee or a bio break. You can use that. But again, I've tried some of these, and the posture which it makes you take to just reach the screen and play, because you need your fingertips on the screen. It's not very natural. It's not like lounging on your couch and playing a PlayStation with a controller. So, you're not going to game like this all the time. Maybe you'll do it for the first 15-20 seconds because, again, it's cool and it's a feature you paid for in your car which you want to be utilized. But it's not something that's natural. It's not something that's required more than anything else. But again, there are some apps which are extremely helpful, like Park Plus, for example. Especially in congested cities like all the in the metros, where
charging apps as well.
Charging apps, exactly. So there are some. I mean, it all depends on what your use case scenario is as a driver, as a user of the vehicle.
True. That's a very interesting point. I mean, I never thought about that in terms of posture. I think we've all been used to now having the device closed in our hands.
Lean forward into something, and I mean, it's not something for the long term. Like I said, you could do it for a few seconds, only to make yourself feel good that, okay, I've used something I paid for.
Correct.
But it's not something that comes naturally.
So, clearly then, okay, let's say we are very clear that we shouldn't get wowed by long laundry list of apps, in terms of horoscopes. I mean, I've seen some, horoscopes and things like that. Like you said, Sudoku, driving games, whatever. Let's not give too much importance to that. But what about, functionality, let's say within apps or within screens? Like I've noticed, for example, we don't actually do this often enough, but we say, okay, there's a touch screen, there's voice control and things like that. Pinch to zoom doesn't actually work on all touch screens, right? You can use pinch to zoom, and I find that very handy for example, when I'm coming up to a flyover, Western Express Highway, it's your sort of thorn as well.
Nemesis.
Exactly. You want to zoom in quickly to see, is the flyover below jammed, or can I risk it or not? And it just is damn irritating when it doesn't do that. Why do cars not do that? Is it a hardware? Is it a software issue? What's the issue behind?
That's a very interesting question and a conundrum as well, because it's not a very simple answer. I think it's a mix of various factors. Number one is the hardware, because the screen itself has to be multi-touch enabled, which has certain cost implications. And if you have a screen which is multi-touch enabled, then of course there are associated hardware costs, like you need a faster CPU to run that multi-touch screen. You need more RAM, memory, basically. So all of that is a cost implication directly to the auto manufacturer. In terms of the software itself, it all depends, because every car has a different architecture on what it's built. The electrical systems, the operating systems, and the app. I mean, it could be Google Maps, which is so ubiquitous. But for a Google Maps to work with a certain car OS, with a certain phone model, there are multiple different architectures at play over there. So how an app interacts and acts with a certain car on a certain screen, even within the same brand, within the same make, might be very different. So it's not a simple answer. And I think until we have more standardization in these things, or the costs come down. Maybe multi-touch screen in the next couple of years becomes like the de facto standard because of the price parity between regular screens. Like how capacitive screens have become the norm now. Earlier it used to be resistive screens. We had to like literally push, not
Exactly.
touch.
I think the Quid, if I remember right, was probably a resistive screen, or at least it felt like.
And it was such a poor experience, right?
Right.
We literally had to touch, push our way into the screen and not touch.
Yeah. And another thing which I know infuriates you, because I don't mind wired, phone connectivity. I like the fact that I get a charge as well because my phone doesn't have wireless charging.
You get better sound quality.
Really?
Yeah, you get better sound quality via wired. It's again latency, but yes, for the convenience factor, wireless is king.
Right. So, but one question there then. So I'm happy with this. But one question: a lot of people are very annoyed when they don't have wireless projection for their phones, right, into cars. And then maybe rightly so. Like if you're sitting on the rear, chauffeur driven, and you want your phone hooked up. Why is this an issue with certain cars, and is again cost, or is it a complicated answer? Like Hyundai, for example, have it on the smaller screens; they don't have it on the larger screens. What's the reason for this?
It's been a pain point with I think all Hyundai and Kia cars for the past few years. Where in fact the smaller screens used to get wireless CarPlay and Android Auto, and the larger screens, the 10.25-inch models, were still needed to be wired. And I think the answer for that again, it depends. Because first of all, both the systems were designed by different teams in different countries. There was also an issue with who gets priority access for the navigation button, because every car has a built-in sat-nav, at least the higher-end variants. In this case, in the Hyundai and Kia case, it used to be the 10.25-inch screens, which used to have the built-in sat-nav. Now, the built-in sat-nav was by My India, and there was a dispute of sorts, or a disagreement of sorts, between the smartphone manufacturers, not the smartphone manufacturers, but the tech companies, basically. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
The people who used to make the operating systems, between them and Hyundai, whether who will get the access to that hardware button,
hotkey. Okay.
the hotkey for navigation. So I think they took a few years to iron that out, and now I think finally they have settled that. And now, regardless of which model you buy, I think from the next generation onwards, both of them will have wireless CarPlay. But I think in the greater scheme of things, again, it depends on the architecture. It has no simple answer, but it all depends on the architecture of the car, when it was designed, because as you would know, typically cars take about 2 or 3 years, in terms of the development cycle. But even more so from the engine and chassis point of view. But even the electrical systems, the in-car entertainment systems, they have a 2 or 3 year lead time, for R&D and development.
Right.
So by the time they actually start the development to the time it hits the market, standards have changed, architecture has changed. Maybe like I said, the big tech companies have introduced a new feature which could not be incorporated. And hence, I think you have the ability and the facility to have OTA updates as and when it could require.
I think, like you said, the phone manufacturers are getting more and more integrated with cars. There's more discussions going on. Who has access to what? I've heard also that there have also been a lot of discussions between not the phone manufacturers, but like you said, the OS manufacturers and car manufacturers who has customer data. That's another bone of contention between a car manufacturer and the OS, because everyone wants data, right? Today, data is sort of king.
Yeah.
A car manufacturer says, hey, but this is my customer, so the data stays with me.
Yeah.
The OS guy says, but it's my OS. I want that data. And so this, I think this is going on. But what's interesting for me to see is that while they have this sort of, disagreements and let's say these discussions that they're having, the integration is also getting deeper. We have heard now that the phone OS manufacturers are going to be taking over car functions as well, even down to like your HVAC controls, your AC and heating.
And even your driver display.
And your driver display, right. Have you experienced this and what's it like and what can we look forward to?
I've seen the prototypes. I've not experienced it in any production model car because they haven't been rolling out yet. But I know for sure that Aston Martin and Porsche have already gone on record saying that by 2024, they should be having models with functioning next-gen CarPlay, as what Apple is calling it. Android Auto also has announced similar plans to take over your driver digital display, your HVAC controls, and your the main infotainment screen. So everything is going to be unified. And the way they're going to do it is very interesting because especially the next-gen Apple CarPlay, I don't think they want to take over your entire system and make it Apple CarPlay. What they're doing it is, they're doing it in an interesting fashion where they're giving designers basically a toolkit which has different colors, which has different styles. The font they're keeping similar. because they have this font called San Francisco, which is very familiar to Apple, and it's very typical of Apple. I mean, if you see any kind of Apple communication or even their OS, they use this font called San Francisco.
Okay.
No surprise because they are from San Francisco. But within that sandbox, they do have a lot of options for the car designers to have their own sort of UI flavor. So you can change the typography. You can have it italics, bold, slim font. You can change the color of the dials. You can have different elements, of course. So they're just going to give the toolkit to the designer of the car UI and UX and try and make it, more car specific and bespoke to your brand. But at the same time, everything will be unified within the Apple CarPlay system. Now, the way they're doing it is having layers. So there are certain things which will always reside on your car. So, for example, if you get into a car, you can't wait for 20 seconds for your OS to load or for the CarPlay to load, which currently takes when you switch on your car, and even if it's wireless or wired CarPlay, it takes a few seconds for the CarPlay screen to appear on the main infotainment display. It's not going to happen with the next generation because first of all, it's demands that it's wireless. That's the first requirement. It has to be wireless. It won't work on wired. So the moment you get into the car or even open the door, your certain systems are already preloaded, which happens the first time you pair your device to the car. In the first instance, the first pairing, all the critical data will be paired to the car and stored in the car. So it's instantaneous on. And then they have different layers, for different criticalities of functions. For HVAC, for media, for your indicator lights, and so on. And maybe all the different malfunction lights as well.
So it's like a hierarchy.
It's a hierarchy, yeah.
First to the...
And then they also have something called punch through in terms of ADAS or in terms of rear view cameras, where you need to have the car's hardware take over. They have something called the punch through layer, which means that if you're using something called the blind view assist, it's going to trigger the car system, and the car's cameras will interact with the CarPlay, and it'll show you the feed via CarPlay, but through the car's hardware. So they have given, I think, enough leeway to the manufacturers to add their own flavor. And of course, you can't compromise safety. So there are certain things that Apple knows that it's not good at, which is, making hardware for, say, car cameras or LiDARs for cars or radars or sensors. Right. Those things they're keeping in the domain of the car manufacturers, but the way you interact, the human-machine interface is going to be taken over by Apple.
Oh, Android. Right. But even with all these tools, it's going to be an uphill task for Apple to convince established car brands to adopt the next-gen OS because, for example, Mercedes is already in transition from MBUX to MBOS. And similarly, other brands also have spent millions, if not billions, in developing their own operating systems. So I think the lower-tier car manufacturers who don't have the resources to develop their own OS stand to gain a lot more from adopting this next-gen CarPlay.
That's interesting. In fact, I was just going to ask you that question. What happens as they extend into the IP display? You don't want to wait for your speedometer dials to be loaded, right?
Or also, like you mentioned earlier, if there is a blackout, if there is a malfunction of the entire display, you can't afford to have a completely blacked out screen in front of you, especially if you're driving at night with no lights. Right. You need some assistance. So, which is why they have different layers where certain things are going to be running on a different processor. BlackBerry, surprisingly, is not dead yet. They have
really, yeah. I've not heard this name being said in a long time.
BlackBerry is well and alive, and they have this thing called QNX, which is their operating system for car UIs, and it's a real-time OS, which means that it's instantaneous on and off. It always resides on the car. So it's going to be a combination of having BlackBerry QNX for the main driver display, which is your critical information, right? And maybe a Qualcomm Snapdragon processor, which is, of course, rich in graphics, great for processing speeds. It has an NPU, the neural processing engine, which will connect it to maybe Car2X, whatever opens up into the future. So all the high-tech features will reside on the Qualcomm processor. It could be running with an NVIDIA GPU as well, which gives you those game-like quality in terms of the visuals, the graphics, everything, the overlays. We have augmented reality maps in some of the cars nowadays. So all that run via NVIDIA's GPU. So there's a lot of things happening, but just to keep it separate, they have two different processors. One for critical driver display and one for the infotainment and media.
Got it. So that's interesting. And then we got to discuss phone manufacturers and tech companies eventually making cars, right? I mean, they're going out, they're spreading into the IP panel. Like we said, we're going out. We know Sony and a few brands, and I think you've seen some of these as well, right? But you share with us, who's where in terms of tech companies making cars.
Dyson and Apple, brands which are known for making innovative products, which have maximum resources, at their disposal in terms of, be it engineers, battery tech, They basically are the pioneers, and even they could not actually see through their automotive projects. Both of them had to abort their projects very late into the day after investing billions of dollars in research and development, having labs, having research centers only dedicated to the car project. Both of them had to shelve the project. So I think it's a great example that it's not as easy as just going to China and picking up parts and assembling your own car just because you know how the software works. It's a whole different ball game. But at the same time, we've also seen Sony have the Afeela, which is their collaboration with Honda, and they showcased a working prototype at last year's CES, which is the world's biggest tech exhibition.
Right. But will we see that in production, and how soon?
So they've announced plans to start taking orders in 2025 with production starting in 26. So, I mean, it really might see the light of day. It's not just a pipe dream. Just Xiaomi, for example, they just showcased their SU7, which is their first car. It's already on sale in China in select cities. They already showcased it in India as well, just last week. And I think like I was saying, the certain inherent advantages to that is because it runs on HyperOS, which is Xiaomi's own operating system over Android. The car knows when it's going to, I mean, you can geotag and you can geofence your house. The moment the house and the devices in the house know that the car is approaching, you know, for example, if you have a Xiaomi air conditioner, the air conditioner will switch on automatically knowing that you're 2 kilometers away and it needs to pre-cool the room. If you have a Xiaomi microwave oven, for example, or maybe a robo vacuum, it'll start springing into action and start cleaning up the house. So there are certain advantages like the Sony Afeela again. Of course, I mean, the biggest draw is that you can play a PS5 within the car because it's a Sony car, and first thing you would want to do is play a PlayStation inside the car.
But
so
not
of course,
poking at the screen like
not
you
poking
said.
at this with the actual PS5 controller.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
which is really cool, and it has again A pillar to A pillar screen,
Right.
so it's completely immersive. But again, you know, there are certain safety advantages to that. When it knows that you're looking into your phone because it also has ADAS functions, and if you do get distracted, if your hands are off the wheel and you're looking into your phone, the car knows that you're looking into your phone because it's a Sony phone. At least that's what they showed in in the prototypes. It's going to send you an alert on the phone itself to look up. So because again everything is linked and they can control the phone experience and the car experience, and hence the driving experience. So there are certain inherent advantages. Eventually, how it's going to boil down into the production versions, we'll of course have to wait and see. But it is going to be a reality. Like for example, taxis are becoming completely autonomous in the US. There is Waymo, which is a service, which is a robo-taxi service. They already have more than 200 taxis flying in San Francisco, in I think Phoenix, if I'm not mistaken as well. It's a project by Google. And it's a completely driverless cab. And to see it in action, the last time I was in the US, I actually hailed one. And it's a bizarre experience. I mean, to be sitting in a car with no driver and, to see it navigate traffic, stop at a red light, take the right turn, avoid obstacles, avoid jaywalkers. Not that you have many in the US, but cyclists. It's just, it's surreal, the entire experience. And it's happening now. So in the next 2-3 years, I'm sure it's going to become more and more commonplace.
So were you seated forward that way, ready to jump out, or were you able to relax with the driverless cab?
It takes a while. I mean, I won't lie. I mean, I was nervous because who's ready for that, right? Nobody is. And especially if it's your first experience, you do have this innate instinct to not trust in tech completely. Like even right now, I know when we have ADAS in certain cars, you know that it's going to brake on its own. But again, intuitively, your foot still goes on the brake pedal. Even in demos, even in closed room demos when we've had, it's just how we are wired and how we are instinctively tuned now.
Right.
So it takes a while to get used to it, but it's happening. Google is already invested heavily in Waymo. Amazon has a service called Zoox, if I'm not mistaken, and that's also like a robo-taxi project. There are some in China by Alibaba, which is one of the biggest tech companies in China. So these kind of projects are springing up everywhere. Whether it's going to become mainstream or no, again, it depends on the legislation as well. Like you said, different countries will have different laws. In India, of course, I don't see this happening anytime soon.
Yeah.
It's hard enough for drivers to, be alert. Forget driverless cars to be as alert. So it's going to take a while, but it's happening.
Correct. But I think Nishant, when we talk, and I know you guys also get very excited when tech companies cross over into cars. I think this route, Waymo, where it's a big tech company taking an existing sort of maybe a hardware, let's say in terms of a car, gutting it out and sort of making their version of it. would be the faster and easier way, because there's so many more challenges to a car. And like you said, Dyson, Apple, lots of money poured into it, realized, hey, it's difficult, because it is difficult to make a car. I mean, it's beyond just also then making the car, right? There's so many legislations, laws and all to pass and things like that. Then there's also distribution, sales, there's service. I mean, we know even two-wheeler brands.
Yeah.
Ola, for example, very like sort of famously, he tweeted and said, okay, we're going to do cars. Now they're scaling back that. And they are a automobile manufacturer, so to speak. They do make two-wheelers. And okay, now there's just two more wheels, but it's not that simple, right? It goes up tremendously. So I think, of course, hats off to Xiaomi. I'm waiting to see the car. I haven't seen it, for being a phone manufacturer who's made a car.
Yeah.
Grounds up.
And to be honest, it seems like a very decent first attempt.
Okay.
In fact, it does not feel like a first attempt. The fit and finish quality, the kind of technology they've integrated within the car itself. Of course, the screen is great, very fluid, which is something you would expect from a phone manufacturer to not falter on the software and the graphics. So they've nailed that as well. But even, just the overall feel, it doesn't feel like you're sitting into, you're stepping into a car which is a first attempt by a phone manufacturer. I mean, Tesla, I think, is one of the only outliers I can think of who had no background as such in making cars, and they become such a huge success story. And including their software, right? I mean, the tech itself is up there. In fact, they are the ones who sort of pioneered autonomous driving.
Yeah, made it popular at least.
Made it popular, made it more mainstream. And the interesting thing about that is it's a very different technology than what other brands use, because Tesla, I think, again, if I have my facts correct, they are the only ones that use only cameras to detect the environment. Whereas all the other brands that we know, even current cars with ADAS systems, they all use some combination of sensors, radars, LiDARs even, which are a lot more sophisticated than just cameras. So when you think of it, the kind of sophistication Tesla has built into its camera systems is mind-blowing, because just relying on cameras and having a completely driverless experience means that you really have to peak in that technology sector, which they have.
Which they have, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and while we're talking of cameras and, let's say, hardware, let's also talk a little bit about audio systems, right? That's the other aspect of tech companies entering, the car space. Branded audio. We've got branded audio now today in everything from a Mercedes to a Tata to a Mahindra to, Jaguar Land Rovers. Do you think these audio companies will also start wanting to, sort of extend their reach inside the car, or will they be limited to the audio experience only?
Well, it's a great selling point for, the auto brands, because, of course, it adds a certain level of premiumness. It just gives that air of premiumness around in the cabin experience, because it's not just the sound. Even when the system is switched off, Burmester, for example, in the new Mercs, the grills are so ornate. Like if you look at the CAF system in the Lotus electric vehicles, the current electric vehicles, just the grills make the cabin environment feel a lot more upmarket than it could have been otherwise without those grills. So they do invest a lot in the aesthetics, not just the sound alone. The sound, of course, is a big draw.
Yeah.
But
I agree. I mean, because as you accuse me very often, I buy all my audio equipment with my eyes.
With your eye.
So it makes a difference.
And I think it's true for a lot of people. It's not just, you're not in isolation. In fact, so many of us, we prejudge a system or a particular sound that may emanate from a headphone, from a loudspeaker, from a car audio by the way it looks. And Macintosh is a great example of that. It's a very high-end home audio brand, which has, again, migrated to a certain extent in automotive world via the Jeep Grand Cherokee and the Wagoneer.
The Wagoneer.
Yeah, so they actually have, the home audio brand is known for its VU meters, which are the blue dials with the thin needles that show the output reading. They've actually brought that same kind of feel into the Jeep. And that, again, evokes such a different experience for anybody who's driving, either being driven or driving themselves. It just, like I said, makes the sound even sweeter even before you put on a sound. Only because you know that it's there. You're looking at those cool blue meters. It takes you back, back in the 60s and 70s. It has a nice vintage feel about it. But even apart from that, all the cars that are currently sold in India, like I mentioned, Lotus has the CAF system. All the new Mercedes have the Burmester system. Meridian in the JLR cars. We have Bowers and Wilkins in the BMWs. They all sound pretty good. In fact, we've done a video on that as well.
Right. Yeah.
And I think it's not going to be them taking over any other area of the car, because they are very specialized brands in themselves. They are good at doing sound, and that's what they do in the car environment. which is also a challenge because not every car is the same sounding, because it all depends on the cabin volume, on the upholstery, on the amount of glass area, the greenhouse area. It all depends, how you tackle all those challenges, because everything is a reflective or an absorptive surface. And to have the right balance of that absorption and reflection is the key to great sound, how it's calibrated finally. So we've seen brands within the same brands also sound being very different, maybe from a C class to an S class. It could be the same Burmester system, but it's a very different sounding Burmester system. And obviously the higher you go up in the hierarchy, the more speakers you get, the more power you get. You also get Dolby Atmos nowadays, which is again the next big thing in terms of in-car entertainment tech.
Yeah, I mean, we've heard Mahindra is now looking at Dolby Atmos, introducing it, I think, to India, the Born Electric series. So that's something to look forward to, for sure. Also, while they were talking of looking forward to tech, and before we wind up, but I also want to bring in sort of telecom, 5G.
Yeah.
How would that change, and what can we look forward to in terms of 5G sort of benefits in car? I mean, for me, I really am excited about, the car-to-car sort of capability that you can have. Volvo, for example, are saying, one Volvo car could alert another car behind about, let's say, an impeding sort of disaster or a danger thing.
Or
what else can we look forward to? What would 5G bring to, an automotive user?
The first thing I think it will democratize is car to X. The way we think of car to X, which is basically, like you said,
So why car to X? You mean car to anywhere?
Cars anywhere. It could be car to car. It could be car to maybe in a cell tower. It could be car to a traffic signal as well. If you're living in a smart city, it could be car to the manufacturer also, and then they can relay the information back to all their cars. So it could be various permutations and combinations of that. But it's going to help a lot because in terms of the latency, 5G is a lot better and a lot faster than current 4G. Of course, it has its own challenges in implementing 5G everywhere and getting the right coverage area. Right now, we are struggling with 4G, across different corners of the country. So it's going to be, again, I think, a pipe dream. But when it does happen, and eventually it will happen, it is going to change a lot of things, including entertainment as well. Because I'm sure in the next few years, streaming to the car is going to become very native and commonplace. And of course, augmented reality maps, because I think going forward, we've already seen that in some of the new Mercs again. In the EQA that we drove a couple of weeks ago, it was one of the first cars to have augmented reality maps over and above, the live feed that you're getting from the camera. So you see the live feed from the front camera, and it overlays 3D maps on top of that, so you know exactly when to take a left or right or go
Which lane
or a roundabout, building names and all those things. And all those things are very intensive in terms of both processing and the data it gets from the cloud. And again, 5G is going to be imperative in making sure that those experiences are seamless.
Right. So great. I think there's a lot to look forward to then, with even something as simple as a faster data connection.
Yeah.
Right. 5G. So thanks, Nishant, for joining us on our Deep Drive podcast. Right. It's
My
been,
pleasure.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure chatting with you. And guys, in case you haven't already, of course, subscribe to the Autocar India channel, because we've got great content like the podcast, weekly podcasts, which come up every Saturday at 11 a.m. And of course, fantastic car reviews. Thank you.